went out around, I don't know, 12:30 and walked, and it was plenty hot.
It was warm enough. I have a very big fluffy dog, so I have to go at about 5 a.m. and about 10 at night to walk around.
Okay.
We have someone who's commenting already, Bill Smith, and he said that, well, he said other than my system freezing once yesterday was great. But then he also said that you are hotter than I am in Florida.
Yes, I sure am.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you are all set, we will go ahead and get started.
I am.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Some of you have already been in here for a few minutes. Today we are kicking off our second day in our week 3 theme of Democracy in America. My name is Dakota Harkins, and I'm the Director of Education and Heritage Programming here at Lakeside Chautauqua. And in a few moments, I'll introduce again Dr. Paul Beck, who is joining us to teach us more about democracy and its possible decay, both here and abroad. But before we get to that, I would like to make a few reminders about this season. As most of you realize now, we are Zoom webinaring all of our programs for the Chautauqua Lecture Series this season. For those who are having trouble accessing those programs, all of our programs can be found at lakesideohio.com/calendar, and that will take you to the calendar of events for all Lakeside programs. And when you get to each of the days that one of our Chautauqua Lecture Series programs are happening, you'll see a purple banner at the top of those dates. And if you click on that banner, it will take you to a separate page that has a list for the entire week of education programs. And each of the programs have a link on them for either the live Zoom webinar or for the recorded version that we're trying to get up within 24 hours of each of the programs for those days. If you do have any questions throughout the season about the calendar or about accessing the programs, please feel free to contact me at dharkins@lakesideohio.com. For those of you who are on site, we are opening up first come, first serve, very limited seating in Chautauqua Hall to watch the programs that are going on Zoom on the monitors in Chautauqua Hall. So those will be limited, and we are shutting the doors at 10:30, and so that we'll have time to space everyone out and have safe programming there. And then another reminder, a few of you are getting pretty used to this, but just as we do whenever we have on-site programs, we are saving our question and answer session until the last 15 to 20 minutes of the program. But throughout Dr. Beck's program today, I will be facilitating and moderating the questions that come in through the question and answer window. So if you're watching this webinar live right now, there is a question and answer section at the bottom of your screen. There's a button you can hit that says Q&A, and that's where we'll be answering all of our questions from. So I do want to remind everyone that Dr. Beck and I, neither one of us can see you or hear you, and we're using Zoom webinar. So if you do have questions, please make sure to use that. And now I would like to welcome back Dr. Paul Beck, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Ohio State University. He was here yesterday teaching us about the elections and the possibilities that may come from 2020. And today he'll be talking more about democracy. So I will turn it over now to him. Welcome, Dr. Beck, and thank you again for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Dakota, and thanks for facilitating this. And again, I'm very eager to talk to the group today and look forward to some really good questions as I got yesterday. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that people can see this. Okay, and there's the title of the talk. It's a little bit of a change from what I had initially said, but it's probably more connected to what I'm going to talk about today. So let me go forward. And I want to talk first about the historical record, in a sense. There are a number of scholars and many observers, in fact, who have worried in recent years about the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of dictatorships. The scholars probably who are best known for this are 2 Harvard professors, Levitsky and Ziblatt, and they wrote a book in 2018, or it was published in 2018, called How Democracies Die. And they've identified some key threats to democracy in the past, and I'll talk about the past in just a minute, as well as in the present. Now, some of these are threats that have arisen since their book, but Levitsky and Ziblatt have been on the lecture series, and so they folded in these other countries as well to their narrative. The countries that I think are the cases that they pay the most attention to are, of course, Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, the Adolf Hitler regime, Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, Francisco Franco in Spain, some of the dictatorships in Latin America in earlier decades, the Soviet Union, when there was a Soviet Union, and its satellite countries in the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. Those become important cases for them because what they'd like to do is draw upon those cases to identify the kinds of things that really distinguish authoritarianism, distinguish the threats to democracy, and they use that to build the narrative that they have in their book. And then at the present time, there are some really good examples of authoritarianism. One that has arisen fairly recently is in Brazil, where Bolsonaro was elected president in 2019, or excuse me, 2018, and has been very authoritarian. Is in trouble now because of the rise in the coronavirus. There a lot of blowback to his presidency. We will see how that does going forward. Hungary may well be the best case of authoritarianism, where you had the election of Viktor Orban way back in 2010, and then gradually over time, he has consolidated his power in a variety of ways. Right now, with the coronavirus pandemic, he is ruling by decree, which means the legislature is literally unimportant there. He's ruling by what we in the United States would call executive order. And he appears to be very happy with that. I'm not sure the Hungarians are, but probably a majority of them are. Poland is another case that has arisen fairly recently as a budding dictatorship. Right now, there is an election that will be held on Sunday, in fact, in Poland, which is a runoff election between Duda, who is the current president in Poland, current prime minister, I'm sorry, in Poland, and his centrist opponent. And if Duda is reelected, you could see a rise in authoritarianism there. If he is defeated, there will be a battle over the transition, and whether the transition will be smooth or not, we don't really know at this point. But nonetheless, Poland is a recent case that is another one of these case studies in the decay of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism. Russia, of course, we see Vladimir Putin all the time. His rule now has been extended by decree or by constitutional amendment all the way, I think, if I remember right, to 2036, if he lives that long. So he really has taken control there, and Russia has become more and more authoritarian over time. And then the other case of recent note is the case of Turkey, where elected in a popular election, Erdogan gradually over time has consolidated his power in a variety of ways. And I'm going to tick off the ways in just a second as generic ways that this happens. But Erdogan, again, is one of these new authoritarians in present life, in present day politics. Now, in the authoritarian playbook, as Levitsky and Zimblad may have called it, are 4 different things that are important in identifying what the threats are to democracy. And I'd like to go through these one by one, and then I'll come back to them later on as we talk about the present, both abroad and in the United States. One is a rejection of the democratic rules of the game. Authoritarian leaders simply play by different rules. They pay no attention to what the norms, what the precedents have been, and they kind of make their own way, defying the rules, defying the kinds of arrangements that typically are made between ruling groups or ruling elites or contesting groups that are contesting for power. They often challenge the legitimacy of the electoral system. If they don't do well in an election, are very quick to decry the conduct of the election, to cry fraud. They also, of course, are not beneath trying to manipulate that electoral system in ways that are advantageous to them. So they generally are undermining democratic norms. And we're used to the rule of law, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. We're used to the rule of law kind of dominating things and being important, and it is. It's very important. On the other hand, there are a whole set of relationships among ruling groups, among people who are in leadership positions, and between them and the public, that are sort of honored because they have been there for a long time. And those also are threatened and become part of the authoritarian playbook, is to reject those democratic norms. A second thing, number two, is attacks on opponents, sometimes very vicious attacks. For one thing, they deny the legitimacy of political opponents, including the press, the free press, and argue that anybody who is opposing them is illegitimate and doesn't really have a right to be contesting elections or contesting their rule. They also are very tolerant and even encourage violence against opponents. Sometimes they have paramilitary forces. This is certainly true in Germany in the 1920s, the 1930s. There actually were two different groups that had very violent paramilitary forces. One were the National Socialists, Hitler and his supporters. The other one was the Communist Party. And these paramilitary forces often would combat with each other on the streets of German cities and German towns. And there was considerable violence, a lot of death, certainly a lot of injuries there. It was the Nazis, of course, among the paramilitary forces who ended up being the dominant of the two. But for a long time, there was really almost open warfare between the communists and the Nazis. And then they also are very quick to curtail the civil liberties of opponents. They will jail opponents. Putin tends to use this as a weapon against the most serious of his opponents. He just throws them in jail for violating one law or another. They harass opposition leaders. Sometimes it is their supporters who turn up at opposition rallies and heckle and jeer and in some cases push people around and engage in some violence there. They also will ban opposition leaders from the ballot. We see this, by the way, in Iran, which is another country that is authoritarian in recent years. And there, the religious council actually decides on who the candidates can be. And they will kick off a lot of candidates, knock them off the ballot, who they think will give some kind of challenge to the ruling elites in that country. So civil liberties are curtailed. This has been, by the way, a very powerful weapon in Turkey, where a couple of years ago, Erdogan actually jailed a number of opposition elites and members of the bureaucracy and the military, arguing that they were engaged in this plot against him, and he needed to root that out. And thousands of people were actually incarcerated under his rule. It turns out that I've been involved in this cross-national product called the Comparative National Election Project, and one of our participants is a scholar in Turkey, and he at the time was the dean of his college and was stripped of that position, accused of some kind of seditious activity. It never really was proven, and he later was restored to his faculty position, so that came out all right. But we, for quite a while, were very worried about him and very worried that he might also turn out to be one of the ones who is jailed. So there are attacks on opponents, and as I said, sometimes those attacks are and can be very vicious and violent. The third thing that's important in terms of the authoritarian playbook and the ways to detect decays of democracy is an erosion of the rule of law. The rule of law is important. Many American business people, when they attempt to do business in other countries, are very worried about the sanctity of contracts. You sign a contract, those contracts in the United States tend to be enforced in the rule of law, enforced by courts. You know what the rules are, basically. In other countries, often these contracts can be voided or avoided by people who have pretty strong ties to the ruling elites in those countries. And so American people in business who are attempting to set up some kind of business in another country pay a lot of attention to the rule of law. They want to believe that if they enter into agreements to open their businesses there, those agreements will indeed be honored. Part of that also involves politicization of the bureaucracy and of law enforcement. To authoritarian leaders, the bureaucracy, the executive branch bureaucracy, the presidential bureaucracy in some countries, is theirs. And these are thought to be their employees. And the desire on the part of the leader is that these employees be loyal and do what the leader wants them to do. Often this pervades law enforcement, that the laws are enforced in such a way that those who are favored by the authorities in these authoritarian countries are benefited. Those who are not favored by the authorities, of course, are not benefited. These authoritarian countries also are full of conflicts of interest and corrupt use of powers to advance personal and private interests. Again, the best example of this probably is Russia these days, where it's a country full of oligarchs who have strong ties to Vladimir Putin. They're the ones who are allowed to make millions, if not billions, of dollars because they have the state behind them. There are other people who are not so favored, and people who fall out of favor with Putin. And when they fall out of favor with Putin, they often are leaving Russia, sometimes encouraged, sometimes just fleeing to leave Russia. And then what we find is that they are harassed around the rest of the world. And then finally, the authoritarian playbook really is an executive powers playbook. The authoritarians are executives themselves, presidents typically, sometimes prime ministers, but typically presidents. And they use their powers in an expansive way, especially against the legislatures and the courts in those countries. So those are the four things in the authoritarian playbook. I've talked, by the way, about countries, but Levitsky and Ziblack also talk about instances in American history where there has been kind of an authoritarian rise or an authoritarian push. And the ones they talk about, probably the best example of them is the period of Jim Crow laws after the end of Reconstruction in the South, where the Southern political system was really taken over by what is best called the plantation elites, the people who had been the slaveholders prior to the Civil War. And they began to cook the books, to change the rules, to change the practices in a way that disadvantaged anybody who would challenge their authority. Certainly focused with the Jim Crow laws against blacks, against former slaves, but also focused against poor whites, who many of these plantation owners and large business people in the South at that time, this is the 1880s, 1890s, saw as real threats to their domination. And so what they attempt to do is to change the rules of the game, to change the norms of democratic practice in those states. And those things occurred all the way up into the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1950s and certainly the 1960s. And as we know, in many cases, they persist to this very day. So Jim Crow laws are an example of something that happened in the United States that was kind of an authoritarian thrust in a way, at least in a part of the country. Another example that Levitsky and Ziblack talk about is the court packing attempts of President Roosevelt in the late 1930s. Here was an attempt to undermine the power of the Supreme Court by adding new members to it whom he would appoint. It was beaten back. There was not much support for it in the Congress or in the country more broadly. But here was an attempt to, in a way, expand his rule as an executive. A third one is the McCarthy era, where there were attacks not by a chief executive necessarily, but by a sitting senator against Americans whom he attacked as being communists or having communist sympathies. There was a period of, 5 to 6 years or thereabouts, where there was a lot of authoritarianism in this country and in a dangerous way. And then, of course, the fourth one is Watergate, where the president, in the end, President Nixon, was not able to exert the kind of authority that he wanted to exert, perhaps, mainly because his fellow Republicans in the Congress said, President Nixon, it's time for you to go. You have violated the rules of the game. You violated the rule of law, and you no longer, in our view, are a legitimate president, and we are going to vote against you once things come to the Senate and there's a vote on whether to convict you of the offenses that were in the impeachment indictment. Okay, so those are things to bear in mind, things that really are, you might almost think of them as things to look for as threats to democracy. And if you see these things occurring in a particular country, you can bet that there is a move towards authoritarianism there. Now, one point I want to make that I think is very important is that voters in democracies, and I include Nazi Germany in this, have not consciously elected dictators to office. Rather, the threats to democracy have increased once a leader with dictatorial instincts has come into power. And that's especially true after that leader is reelected, after that leader's tendencies are reinforced by a second election. So voters don't consciously select dictators, but they often are led in their direction once that dictator is in power. And that's something that's really important to bear in mind. Most dictators, most authoritarian rulers have come into their position through elections. And once elected, as I was saying, they are using that to basically expand their powers. Now, the other point I want to make, and I'll come back to this later on, is that partisan polarization, which is something that is endemic in the United States right now, in my view, a very serious problem for us as a country right now, provides conditions that are conducive to the demise of democracy. And the reason is twofold. The reasons are twofold. One is that it raises the stakes of governmental control. If the other side is going to control the government, then woe is us if we are opponents there, because with government control, they're able to do things that we really don't want. And so the risk of control is raised. And then there's a desire to stop it in every way possible, including going beyond the particular practices and norms of democracy. And so it's dangerous. Polarization makes people think, if they are polarized on one side or the other, that they need to do everything possible to stop the other side from being able to win a particular election. Okay, let me move from sort of these general theoretical points that are very much things that are talked about in the scholarly literature. The major source of those, by the way, is the book by Levitsky and Ziblatt, published in 2018. Both of them are professors at Harvard University. There's another book that, if you're interested in pursuing this further, called The People versus Democracy. And the author of that book is a fellow by the name of Yascha Mounk, who is currently at Johns Hopkins University. He focuses more on populism and the kind of threat that populism poses to democracy, but it's a book worth reading as well. Both of those books, by the way, are very readable, even though they are in a scholarly mode, full of citations of one kind or another to back up the claims that are being made. Okay, let me talk about democracies worldwide. And there was a period, really from the 1970s all the way into the early part of the 21st century, when there was growth of democracy. It was a very heady period for democracies. It was a period when those of us who care about democracy were very optimistic that democracy was spreading. The countries that had not experienced this in the past were going to enjoy the fruits of democracy. That has begun to end by the 2010s, the decade of the 2010s. And we now are in a time of democratic decline. Recent elections in democratic or in Western democracies, the old-fashioned traditional democracies like France, like Britain, have seen a rise in populism. Populism is dangerous for democracy for a couple of reasons. One is populists are anti-elite. They feel that people who are in power are basically illegitimate. And the only legitimacy comes from the people themselves. And the people themselves endowing new leaders who rise as opposition to those elites, endowing those leaders with governmental power. The danger to that, of course, is that people who are elected as populists to governmental office don't recognize any other source of legitimacy except the people themselves. And they claim that they are the ones who are acting in the name of the people. And of course, there's no real test of that. And so they are very quick to assume authoritarian tendency. And many of the leaders, by the way, that I talked about in recent decay of democracy countries like Poland and Hungary and Turkey arose initially as populists and then consolidated their power and became more authoritarian over time. The other thing, by the way, about populism is that it often is anti-minority. Populists often attribute the problems in their country to aliens, to the other, quote, end quote. The other can be recent migrants. They can be, in the case of Nazi Germany, Jews and gypsies and other groups. They can be, in the case of Hungary, recent migrants to the country. The other is cast aside as not really a part of the country. There's a rise in nationalism there and a desire to repel these aliens, these others. And it also is connected to anti-system parties, political parties that emerge and attack the prevailing political system itself and argue that if they are to take power, they will not govern by the kinds of democratic practices that the traditional parties have. There's a party in Germany, the AfD, called the Alternative for Democracy, if you translate it into English, and is very much an anti-system party. It turns out it is the leading opposition party in the German parliament right now. So anti-system parties have emerged in some of these countries, even countries that are not currently authoritarian. And I picked off the countries that are serious candidates for authoritarianism. Ones I've already mentioned, and then I would add to that India, which under Modi has become more and more authoritarian over time. There it's Hindu nationalism that seems to be the faith, if you want to call it that, the movement that is propelling him. And there have been attacks there on Muslims and people who are not Hindus. And the story goes on. We'll see what happens in Italy. Now, it turns out there's an organization called Freedom House. Freedom House was founded in 1941. It's what's called an NGO, a non-governmental organization. It's governed by a wide-ranging bipartisan and nonpartisan board. The original board members were Wendell Willkie, who was a candidate for president in 1940, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Roosevelt. Funding, interestingly, comes largely from the United States government right now, mainly because Freedom House was thought to be part of our effort to spread democracy to the rest of the world. Whether it is challenged right now in the Trump administration or will soon be challenged in the Trump administration, we will see. My guess is that if there is a second term for Trump, it will be challenged, and that funding probably will be largely withdrawn and ended. Freedom House issues a Freedom in the World report annually. It's done that since 1972. It has a whole series of measures of two fundamental things that it feels are crucial to democracy. One is a series of political rights, rights in the electoral process, the right to vote, the right to participate in elections, free and fair elections, rights to political pluralism, which means a multitude of groups can contest for power and for influence in the system, how the government itself functions. Does it function in a manner that is open to everybody, basically, that treats everybody fairly, that is unbiased in terms of its treatments of various groups within the population? So political rights are important. And as I said, there are a whole series of indicators that the Freedom House staff looks at country by country by country to determine what the score should be for that particular country in political rights. And then the second point that they are making, the second criterion in a general sense that they use, are civil liberties. Freedom of expression and belief. Our First Amendment rights, for example, would be important there. Rights to association. One of the things that authoritarian governments are very good at is basically removing any kinds of organizations that can challenge them. And so you see a demise of secondary organizations like labor unions, at least labor unions that are free from control from the central authorities. You see in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe a weakening of the church. The church is seen as an alternative organization. And in fact, in some of those countries, Poland is a good example, some of the dissent to authoritarian rule came from the church working behind the scenes and in effect underground, at least some of the clergy there, to try to undermine the authoritarian regime. There are measures of the rule of law and how important the rule of law is in a particular country. And of course, there are measures of personal autonomy, individualism, and individual rights. And what I wanted to do is give you kind of a picture of how Freedom House sees the state of play in the world in 210 countries, the countries that it looks at, in its 2018 report. And what it reports is an erosion of political rights and civil liberties across the world. 68 of the 210 countries declared. Some coming from Freedom House. And then also they report that the US has declined in terms of political rights and civil liberties. From about 2016, that's where the big difference is, all the way to 2017 and 2018.
Dr. Beck, we do
signs of,
I'm sorry. If you
are you losing me?
I lost your presentation again. If you want to screen share your presentation, you froze for a moment and we lost.
Okay, let me go back. Is it there?
There we go. It's up now. Thank you.
Okay, let me now go to the slide I was on. Okay, Freedom House has a special section of its 2018 or 2019 report, excuse me, that looks at democracy in the United States. And the title of that, this, by the way, was a report published in 2019, but it's based on data from 2018. The title of that particular section is "The Struggle Comes Home: Attacks on Democracy in the United States." And it's worth reading. And if you were to Google Freedom House on any of your search engines or use any of your search engines to go to it, you can find that report and actually download the part on the United States. Once it was near the top of the list of democracies, the United States now is in the second tier. And what I'm going to do is show you, assuming that I can, I'm going to show you a selected group of countries, and I hope the type isn't too small here. There is a top group, And they are the ones on the left-hand side there, topped by Finland, Norway, and Sweden, with Freedom House scores of 100, which is the top score. They are at the tops in political rights. They are the tops in civil liberties. If you are a true Democrat and really value democracy, those are the countries you want to live in. There are a number of others that are close to them: the Netherlands, Canada, Australia, for example, Denmark, Ireland, New Zealand. The difference between them and the top scorers is really very modest, very insignificant. And if you look down through that entire list, you will see countries that we generally regard as the Western democracies, with a few others thrown in, like Costa Rica, for instance. Chile is another one. Chile, by the way, has moved from authoritarian, where Freedom House placed it back in the 1980s, all the way into this group of democracies. France and Italy are there as well. You will see in the second group, and in this group, to be able to get all the countries on the one slide that I at least wanted to talk about, I've only gone selectively. There are plenty of other countries that could have been in slide 3, or slide 2 and slides 3 and 4 that I just don't have there. But I thought I would give you samples or examples of countries that are countries where democracy indeed has not fared well over time. You can see that the United States is there at 86. We still are a democracy, but we are not the democracy that we were just a few years ago, and we don't rank up there with some of these other nations that were on the left-hand side. Argentina is there, although floundering a bit in the last year or so. Poland is there. It's floundered a lot in the last couple of years, and we'll find out on Sunday with the election, the runoff election between Duda and his Democratic opponent, whether Poland is going to drop further. Romania is there. South Africa is there, having come out of apartheid when it clearly was not a democracy, back 30 years ago. Israel doesn't fare all that well, largely because of treatment of the Palestinians. There, Brazil is down that list. India is there too. Both of them probably will fall if we move to more recent reports, as will Hungary. Mexico doesn't fare particularly well as a democracy. Singapore, which is an interesting case, it can be thought of as business authoritarianism, very authoritarian, very rule-bound government, but very harsh rules. But it's a country that is quite conducive to business, and businesses like to locate there because it is regarded as stable and safe. You'll see countries that are near the bottom. They're the countries you would expect to be there. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, certainly, Cuba, certainly below them, China, that hardly scores at all on these two indexes of democracy, the political rights and civil liberties. Saudi Arabia is another one. And then North Korea, it truly does anchor the bottom of the scale. It gets a 0 as a score on political rights and doesn't do much better than that in terms of civil liberties. Okay, well, now let me turn directly to the United States. And here you're going to hear my own thoughts about this. When I talked yesterday about the 2020 election, I tried to be very analytic and called it as I saw it in terms of the kind of analysis that would go on, but it probably wasn't very controversial. People on both sides might have been able to see that, well, yeah, he is treating our side fairly. Now that I turn to my own thoughts about the threats to democracy in the United States, I'm going to be bolder than I have been in previous talks. And the bottom line here for me is that we are in a period where there is a serious challenge to our democracy. And it's a challenge in a number of ways. I'm not going to spell all of them out because they are so many. But the challenges tend to mount. They tend to be cumulative. And what I thought I would do is identify the clearest of them, and then we can come back and talk about where we go from here. First, there's been a weakening of Congress relative to the executive branch. The president has overridden the Congress on funding of the border wall. which never got a majority in either the House or the Senate. It's overridden Congress in terms of the use of foreign aid and the use of sanctions, particularly against Russia. It has advanced its nominations, its nominees for various executive and judicial appointments. Senate Republicans have pretty much rubber stamped those, even though numerous senators have decried the quality of the nominee. They nonetheless were not willing to confront the Trump administration and deny its nominees. There, by the way, is a distinction that should be made here between nominations to the executive branch and to the judicial branch. The feeling quite broadly among both Democrats and Republicans has been that the norm is that if a president wants to appoint somebody to a cabinet position or the top ranking positions in the various departments, the Congress, the Senate, ought to give the benefit of the doubt to that. These, after all, are presidential appointments, and the president has a right to be able to appoint members to his own team. It has been less true of judicial nominees, mainly because these are not at-will nominees. These are people who are going to serve in the judiciary, the federal judiciary, for life. And there's a feeling, I think, on the part of both Republicans and Democrats that they ought to be scrutinized more carefully, that these are more consequential decisions. Nonetheless, Senate Republicans have pretty much rubber stamped the people who have been sent to them from the president. There have been a few cases where they basically stalled the nominees and sent signals to the president that they were not going to vote to confirm a particular nominee, and that nominee often has withdrawn or has been withdrawn by the administration. And then there's been an increased use of executive orders. This is true certainly in the Trump administration, where things that he can't get Congress to do, he simply orders as an executive order. Executive orders last as long as that particular person is the chief executive. They can be removed by a new president and often are. I, by the way, would argue that President Obama, before Trump, probably used executive orders more than he should have, at least in my view. And he used them out of frustration that Congress was not going to go along with things that he thought were important to do, particularly Republicans in the Senate who at one point were using the filibuster to try to block legislation there. But generally, there's been an increased use of executive orders in recent years, not just the Trump years, that has weakened Congress relative to the executive. Now, turning to the courts, this has been something that's been very much a feature of the Trump presidency. And it's been a tax on judges, federal judges, who make rulings contrary to what the president thinks are in his interests. Some of these attacks are pretty vicious attacks. Name calling, you remember the attack on somebody of Mexican heritage who had rendered a verdict that the president didn't like, but there have been other attacks on John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, for rulings that he actually either authored as the author of the majority opinion or joined in with the majority, and have not been things that were particularly pleasing to the president. There are also, in terms of the judicial appointments, the nominations that are sent to the Senate for its confirmation have been very narrow loyalty tests. There have been candidates that the American Bar Association and even the Federalist Society, which is a conservative group of lawyers who were making recommendations to the president. There have been people that neither of those groups endorsed. And in fact, in several cases, the Federalist Society had ruled that these were not nominees who were qualified to be federal judges. Nonetheless, because they were loyal to Donald Trump and to the Trump administration, sometimes in ways that were very obvious, the tendency has been to go ahead and appoint them in the Senate to confirm that appointment. There also has been a politicization of the bureaucracy, justified as attacks by the president on the deep state. The deep state are the bureaucrats, some of them holdovers from the Obama, Bush, maybe even Reagan administration, who were opposed to him as president. And there have been all kinds of attempts to try to root them out and remove them from government. There's been a staffing of federal agencies by presidential loyalists, often acting without Senate confirmation. The technique here, by the way, has been to appoint them as acting executives. Sometimes the cabinet secretary, the secretary of a particular department, sometimes the top political appointees within that department. They're appointed as acting because they might not get Senate confirmation. And so they don't really have to come before the Senate. The acting appointments can last for a while. They are not permanent appointments. President Trump has said he actually likes to use acting appointments because he can get rid of them easily if they don't conform to the kinds of things that he wants to be able to do. There's an interesting anecdote here about an acting appointment that I wanted to share with you. The Environmental Protection Agency was headed by Scott Pruitt, who was a Trump appointee early on. But apparently the president didn't quite trust him to act completely in the president's interest. And so he appointed a person as an assistant to the secretary, who was given a desk right outside the secretary's office and reported directly back to the White House on all of the actions that Secretary Pruitt was taking. You may remember that Secretary Pruitt spent some money and was highly attacked. Well, attacked is too strong a word. Was not praised, was criticized for building a phone booth outside of his office. The phone booth was so that he could communicate without this person at the desk outside the office knowing what he was saying to the White House. Very interesting anecdote. There also has been, we see it most notably in the COVID-19 pandemic, a denigration of scientific expertise, an elevation of fiction over fact. And of course, the federal bureaucracy is full of people with great expertise, great scientific expertise that we want to rely upon to get us through COVID-19, to deal, for example, with threats to the environment, to deal with a whole variety of things, including foreign policy issues, people who are really experts, who really know their stuff. And they have been in many ways sidelined and denigrated to the point that many of them who are longtime federal employees are literally afraid to say what they think on a particular policy. In some cases, they've been denied the ability to travel to conferences, to give papers on their area of expertise. This is particularly true when it comes to things that are connected with COVID-19, but also with environments and environmental regulation. There's been a stifling of dissent among career employees, and that's one way that it's occurred. One thing that has come into prominence recently is the dismissal of internal ethics watchdogs, the agency inspectors general, who have issued rulings that the president really hasn't liked very much. And so the next thing you know, and these are appointments that the president can make and unmake, but the next thing you know, they are dismissed, and somebody else who is more loyal is put in charge of that inspector general's office. And then, of course, going back to the impeachment in the House of Representatives, there has been a lot of foreign policy making to further the president's reelection bid. Ukraine is a great example of that. John Bolton, in his recent book, has charged that much of the China policy, particularly China trade policy, the China policy more generally, really is done to further the president's reelection bid, not in the interest of the country. And Bolton has been very critical of President Trump in that regard. Moving to the media, there have been attacks on fake news. Everything, it seems, that the mainstream media, except maybe Fox News, is issuing in its news reports, runs the risk of being labeled fake news. and even Fox sometimes. The most recent example I can think of is where they published a public opinion poll that was not favorable to the president. He attacked Fox as issuing fake news and attacked that poll for being just plainly wrong. There also is a recent example of an appointment that the president has made and was confirmed by the Senate, although with a lot of controversy, of a person to head up the office that oversees the Voice of America and other foreign media or US media that is sent to foreign countries to tell the American story in those countries. It's very clear that that office is being politicized. The new appointment there has fired everybody who stayed on, who headed one of those Voice of America and its counterpart missions. Some of them resigned, fearing what was going to come. It looks like the government media, the government finance media, and this is government finance, is going to be basically unleashed to tell the Trump story rather than more generally the American story. And then finally, there's a threat to the electoral process. There are attempts going on in many states to suppress turnout through a variety of devices, voter ID, changing rules for when you can vote, an attack by the president on absentee voting, attempts to reduce the amount of absentee voting that goes on in some states. Many Republican secretaries of state, by the way, have not joined in that effort and have tried to expand turnout and expand the right to vote and make it easier for people to vote. But they too have come under attack by the administration. There are also challenges to the legitimacy of the electoral process. And if you listen to the president in recent weeks, he's talked about electoral fraud. He's often tied electoral fraud to absentee voting. And he is in some ways laying the groundwork for saying that the election, if it doesn't go his way, is not legitimate. That there's been fraudulent voting. He argued this for the 2016 elections, that Hillary Clinton's popular vote lead by almost 3 million votes was not legitimate because a lot of those were fraudulent votes. There's been no evidence of this. The administration tried to provide evidence of it and simply failed to do so. Challenges to the legitimacy of the electoral process we're going to hear from here on out, I think. And if the election is close, there will be a continued and upgraded drumbeat of those kinds of challenges. If the election is won by Trump, we probably won't hear much about that. If it's won in a landslide by Biden and the Democrats, we will hear more about how illegitimate it was. Okay, some questions to think about, and I encourage all of you to think about. One is, what are the implications in the United States for democracy if Trump is reelected? You will remember me saying that authoritarian leaders are particularly dangerous, and Trump has certainly shown authoritarian tendencies. They are particularly dangerous if they are reelected. It's almost as if voters are saying, yes, go ahead and continue doing what you were doing. We're okay with that. Who does the threat come from? Is it just Trump? If Trump were to be defeated, would we see continued threats to democracy in the United States? I think there's a question about that. I think some of these threats were threats that predate Trump, threats that came more from the Republican side than from the Democratic side, particularly when it comes to use of the filibuster and the blocking of executive actions, and particularly when it came to threats against the integrity of the electoral process. It'll be interesting to see, again, if Trump is to go away, whether the Republican Party returns to the Republican Party of old and the principles that had guided it for most of its life in terms of free trade, in terms of other things that were important principles, moral principles, a moral high ground, or will the party really be the party of Donald Trump? And I think that what we will see is a battle within the Republican Party if Trump goes away, over who is to claim the mantle of the party going forward. By raising the stakes of governmental control, my worry is that partisan polarization provides conditions conducive to the demise of democracy. It seems that the risk of the other side and putting the other side in control justifies attempts to stop it in every conceivable way, including ways that undermine democracy. I think there are dangers there, by the way, from both sides, both from the Republicans and from the Democrats themselves. Now, whether most Democrats and most Republicans are willing to engage in that, of course, we don't know until we see those cases developing, but there is a worry that partisan polarization would lead them to basically demonize the opponents and demonize them in such a way that we just can't let the other side take control. And then there are questions about the entire system. Is it dysfunctional? Is it in need of reform? I think in many ways it is. There are the effects of 4 decades of partisan polarization that I think have led to serious dysfunctionality and made it more difficult for the government to operate and to be able to solve the problems that are in front of us. There is too much money flowing into politics, too much so-called dark money that flows into politics, money that we can't really trace, we don't really know who is spending it. It looks like the 2020 election at the presidential level will involve more spending than any election before. And we're talking about billions of dollars that are going to be pumped into the elections. Many of it dark money that is negative, is hacking the opponents in a very negative way. I think there also are too many lobbyists in policymaking positions. You'll remember that President Trump pledged to basically purge the swamp, to empty the swamp. He invoked and through executive order set up a series of ethics requirements for people appointed to his administration, that they could not go back into lobbying activity, for instance, until the end of his administration. Those kinds of strictures have been largely violated. Lobbyists have moved back and forth between the Trump administration and their K Street offices, and many of them are the most important lobbyists today in lobbying their own agencies. Let me stay on that for just a minute here. There are two, you might think of them as sort of guardrails to democracy that haven't been operating very well in recent years. One guardrail is the political parties. The political parties are supposed to vet candidates for office and make sure that candidates do not go forward with their nomination or with their support who are dangers to democracy. And many of the leaders of both parties realize who these dangers are. The parties, I think, have not done a very good job of this. For one reason is primaries. Primaries take away from party leaders the ability to vet candidates. And indeed, endorsements by party leaders really don't turn out to be very important in the primaries. Voters can elect people over the heads of the ones the party leaders think should be the ones who get that nomination. And then political elites themselves, and I here include members of Congress as well as members of the state legislatures, are supposed to kind of police their ranks also and shut down the kind of anti-democratic, anti-system rhetoric that you sometimes hear from some of their members. They, I think, have not been doing a very good job of that. Okay, are the causes broader than just the US? I think they are. The difficult adjustments to globalization, to migration, have led to anti-system parties, have led to more authoritarianism. Inequality is a big problem, particularly in the richer countries. And what that does is it breeds a willingness to go beyond the principles of democracy to address the problems that people are suffering in those particular countries. And then there's the issue of our democracies less capable in effectively addressing problems that people have. Some have argued that democracies are not very good at doing this. And Winston Churchill, I think, is the one that I would like to end on. Winston Churchill, of course, said that democracy is not a very effective form of government. It's just better than everything else. And that's where I think democracy actually tends to excel. Well, let me stop on that. I'm going to remove the shared screen and come back to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. As always, you give us a lot to think about here. So we did have a number of questions come in. We'll start with the first one. With all the increase in executive orders being used by the president in recent years, what is Congress doing to check the president's power?
Congress is doing very little. They have allowed the executive orders to continue. They have not really tried to block them, though in some cases it's the Senate that would require 60 votes to be able to block them, and they haven't been able to muster the 60 votes. In some ways, and this goes back some time, Congress has been willing to shirk its responsibilities for policy and has given to the president the ability to exercise policies, to invoke policies that Congress doesn't have to take a vote on. Trade agreements are one of them. And that's been a very important thing that Congress has ceded its authority on. The other one is the authority to go to war. There has not been a declared war since World War II. And it's been through the executive that we have gone to war in Iraq twice, in Korea back in the 1950s, in other places around the world as well. It's almost as if Congress wants to not handle the hot issues and let the president do that. And of course, by doing that, it cedes more authority to the president. I think it's not a good thing. One would expect Congress to be more active in those realms. It probably is a byproduct of the dysfunctionality of government, that it's hard for Congress to do much of anything. And so they think, well, okay, let's let the president do it, and the president will take the heat for it.
Okay, so the next one's pretty interesting here. Some suggest that a demos is a prerequisite for democracy, that is, a people with significant commonalities. Do you care to comment on how this may affect our prospects?
Ask me that question again. I didn't hear the first few words.
The question is that there is a prerequisite for people with significant commonalities in a democracy. Do you care to comment on how this may affect our prospects?
Well, the more successful democracies have been those, and you think of the list that I gave you from Freedom House, those with fairly homogeneous populations. And it could well be that they agree on most things. They may disagree on particular policies, but there is not an alien group within them. Now that's being tested in some of the Scandinavian countries that opened up their doors to more migration. And it's been difficult for some of these Scandinavian countries to deal with migration because it brings in people who in some cases are Muslims, who have different religious practices, are not as tolerant as maybe people in the Christian mainstream are, don't treat women in a way that most people in those countries would want women to be treated. So I think, yeah, there is a certain degree of commonality that I think is important. And what we've seen in the United States is a growing apart. You see it mainly in the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that have come after the George Floyd shooting, that there are lots of Americans who feel they are not treated fairly because of the color of their skin. And this makes it difficult for democracies to operate. So there does need to be a certain amount of commonality, a certain feeling that all of us are in this together. One hopes we're moving more towards this in the case of the protests against police effort. I think we are, actually. There has been a fundamental change in public opinion on police practices in the last several months. Whether it stays or not, we'll see. But that fundamental change has been that more and more Americans, which means more and more white Americans, have seen that the police are not treating African Americans and other minorities fairly, and really want us to move towards fair and impartial policing. It's not anti-police necessarily. Some extremists in the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, have argued that police ought to be defunded. I think most Americans don't believe that, but they believe that the practices ought to be improved. And what we really expect is a police force, which has a difficult job to do, will do that job in a fair and impartial manner.
Right. And we do have a question that was asked both on Facebook and in Zoom here, so I should probably get to that one. But how have term limits affected the balance of power in the government?
You know, I think term limits were initially advanced as an idea to try to break the lock that politicians had on office. Some of them serving for, well, take the case of Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is running for his 7th term in the Senate, which means if elected, he will be able to serve for 42 years in the Senate if he ends that term in the normal way. There are a lot of people who felt that those lengthy terms were not a good thing for the state of democracy. And so there was a term limits movement that was very successful a couple of decades ago. It hasn't been successful with Congress because the terms of Congress are set in the Constitution and can't really be changed by legislation. But many state legislatures have term limits. I've felt that as I've watched them over time, and I initially was favorable towards them, thinking that it might be worthwhile to try term limits and see if we could get some effective turnover in many of these state legislatures. I've been disappointed by them in 2 ways. The first way is that they've allowed lobbyists to have much more influence over what state legislatures do, mainly because there's so many members of the legislature who have no experience. They haven't been there before. And there are lobbying groups, some of them nationwide, like one that the Koch brothers have financed, that basically will write sample or model legislation and send that out to all of its members in the state legislatures around the country. And you'll see these laws being passed in identical form because the lobbyists have been involved in basically writing them. The other problem with term limits is that politicians, being very resourceful folks, have figured out ways that they can avoid term limits. They serve their terms in, let's say, the lower house of the legislature, and then they run for the upper house. And because they're well known, they get reelected to the upper house. They serve their terms in the upper house, and then they turn around and get elected to the lower house again. So where there's a will, there's a way. And they figured out ways to be able to bypass term limits. Not most of them, by the way, but some of them have. Now, what they've done is, of course, provided experience. On the other hand, they often are ones who are very much favored by the kind of spending that goes on from very lobbying groups, so that they are ensured that they're going to be elected.
So this one came in on the chat. So again, I'll remind everyone, if you would please use the question and answer so we can get all of your questions to Dr. Beck as we're going along here. But is removal of the filibuster in the Senate viewed as democratic or non-democratic?
You know, that's a good question. I've gone back and forth on the filibuster. I think it's important that minority views be listened to in both the House and the Senate, but particularly in the Senate. And the Senate has long had a tradition where every senator is thought to be the equal of every other senator. And so there's been great deference in the Senate to the ability of people to speak, to amend legislation on the floor of the Senate. It's very unlike the House of Representatives, where the majority party really controls things. In the Senate, historically, it hasn't. But in recent years, the majority has controlled things more and more. And Majority Leader McConnell has been one who basically controls what gets talked about on the Senate floor, much more so than any majority leader in our history. The filibuster in some ways is a way to overcome that. If you want to push through legislation in the Senate, you need to get 60 votes to be able to overcome the filibuster. And that gives the Democratic minority, which right now has only 47 members, the ability to block certain legislation. It certainly gave them the ability to block legislation that was pushed through when the House was controlled by Republicans and the Senate was and the presidency were controlled by Republicans. Now there's going to be legislation that won't pass the House, of course, because of its Democratic control. And so Democrats don't use the filibuster as much. It is an anti-democratic kind of feature, kind of power. It's a power that, by the way, does not apply to judicial appointments. So they can't be filibustered. But it is something that is used by the minority to try to block things which are pieces of policy legislation.
So we did have another one come in through Facebook. A key element in democratic government is compromise. What are your insights on our ability to find middle ground on issues?
Well, I think compromise is really important. And it is one way that we can get around this kind of partisan polarization that we have. The politics of partisan polarization is that if your side supports something and is vociferous in its support of something, they are very readily attacked by the other side, no matter what it is. And so legislators, I think, live in fear that they're going to vote the wrong way and be attacked for their vote. One way to prevent that from happening is for there to be compromise, for both parties and members of both parties to say, okay, we are going to take the same side on this particular issue, which both protects us from attacks by the other side, but as well ensures that we're going to be able to make public policy. And so I think that compromise is fundamental. The framers of the Constitution realized this. They thought they were putting in place a government, a structure of government that would allow for compromise, would allow for the passions in the House of Representatives, for instance, to be cooled in the US Senate. And there's been precious little compromise in recent years. It's happened in a couple of places. One is there was compromise on basically legislation over imprisonment. And I think both sides, for different reasons, realized that we were imprisoning too many criminals for rather small violations of the law, particularly drug violations, particularly drug possession. And it was very costly. So the prisons were full of people who were basically turned into hardened criminals because they had been caught with a bag of marijuana in their car, for example. And so there was real good reform in terms of criminal justice practices. And that was done on a bipartisan basis. And one should credit both the Trump administration and some of its leaders, as well as both parties in the Congress, for getting on board there. Where that kind of compromise has broken down is in dealing with immigration. And there's feeling, I think, among people in both parties that we do need some immigration reform. We need to tighten the laws on the one side, but we also need to be more open to welcoming people and welcoming people who have skills we need, and allowing people to stay in this country who are dreamers, who basically were born here or brought here as young children. There, I think, is a potential for compromise there. It's not going to happen during the Trump administration, which is a very anti-compromise, very anti-immigrant administration.
Mm-hmm. And this is just a question going off of that for me, I guess. But has there been a time where compromise has broken down like this before? A lot of people suggest that it's pretty normal occurrence in political factions, but you said within recent years it's really broken down. Has it happened like this before?
It has really broken down in recent years. There is a scholar who has looked at Senate roll call votes and House roll call votes all the way back to the beginning of the country. And he finds two periods where there was extensive polarization. One period was leading up to the Civil War, where the South and the North were at one another. And they certainly were not going to compromise or made compromise difficult on issues of slavery and whether slavery could be advanced into the new states that were coming into the Union. Compromises were made there. They were difficult, but they nonetheless were made. The Supreme Court, in its Dred Scott decision in 1857, basically said to the Congress, you can't do that. Slaves cannot be freed. And of course, that prompted the Civil War and led to the Civil War. The other period that shows high levels of polarization is the period beginning in the mid-1980s and going all the way to the present. Increasing levels of partisan polarization, both in the Congress in terms of how people have voted, to the point that just a few years ago, there were no members of Congress who were in the middle on votes. They either were on one side or the other. There was nobody who could be appealed to try to forge some kind of a compromise. We saw this on the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, where Obamacare originally was designed in such a way to get Republican votes, both in the House and in the Senate. And by design, the architects of Obamacare built in a whole series of provisions into the Affordable Care Act that were provisions that had been advanced and supported by Republicans and Republican think tanks. In the end, there were no votes for Obamacare in the House and the Senate. It's carried only by Democratic votes. There were a few senators, Susan Collins being one, that were appealed to by the Democrats, thinking that she could be somebody that would be okay on this. They made all kinds of concessions to her in terms of what was in the legislation, but in the end, she voted against it. So there have been failures to compromise, both on immigration reform and certainly on healthcare reform. And compromise is something that many members of Congress fear, because again, they can be attacked by the other side or by their own people in a primary for being compromisers, for selling out their principles. And where primaries are contested and they might be losing a particular primary, they don't want to take that risk.
Thank you. This is an interesting point. I would suggest that England is a nation with increasing differences from immigration, and certainly Canada is. These also come from former British colonies. Would you care to address the differences that these seem to be much better tolerated than the United States?
Well, the answer is they have been better tolerated. Britain, I think, has more problems with immigration than Canada does. Maybe Canadians are just nicer people. I don't know. But Canada's handled immigration in a very intelligent way. Canada requires that people who emigrate into or from another country and come into Canada bring with them skills that Canada needs, whereas the United States doesn't pay a lot of attention to that. Canada has been very careful in that respect. Britain, I believe, has probably had, but I don't know this for sure. It'd be interesting to check to see if there are more people of immigrant backgrounds in Canada than there are in Britain these days. Britain has been open to people who emigrate from British Commonwealth countries and are automatically granted British citizenship. And there have been various periods where there have been a lot of these people coming in to the country. But Britain does indeed have problems with immigration. One of the things I've studied fairly extensively is the Brexit vote in Britain. And it turns out that the Brexit vote and many of the people who voted in favor of Brexit was an anti-immigrant vote. They didn't like the kind of migration that had come into Britain. They didn't like people coming from other countries in Europe for example. And one of the tales that was told often, one of the anecdotes in Britain, was these damn Polish plumbers are coming into Britain. They are taking work that normal Brits would be able to engage in. They're cheaper. We need to send them back home. And so it wasn't just immigration of people with a different skin color or a different religion. It was immigration of people that were coming from other countries and were seen as taking advantage of the hospitality of Britain. Canada, things have been much smoother there. And there are lots of immigrants in Canada. They, I think, Canadians feel have enriched the Canadian culture. Canada, of course, is a bilingual country, requiring both French speaking and English speaking as official languages. And so in some ways that is built in to the country in a way that it is not in Britain.
So this will probably be our last question. We had a number more come in, but we'll close out with this one. President Trump has recently tweeted and talked multiple times that he would be willing to put National Guard troops in states like New York to help with protests and COVID relief. So the first part of the question is, why would governors turn that help down? And the second part of the question is, can Trump override the governor's right to send in troops anyway?
I think the quick answer to that is that the National Guard operates under control of the governor. The way it's happened in the past when troops have been federalized is that the governor asks the president to federalize the troops, but it comes from the governor's request. It probably is not something that is not going to be litigated if it happens. You know, many issues of American politics get litigated because it's not quite clear what exactly the law requires. Now, why would governors object to that? In some cases, they object because they think it's going to politicize the situation within their state. They're very worried of losing control over it. You saw this in the District of Columbia, by the way, where the president actually and the Justice Department was able to federalize the authorities there. And it created real problems. And of course, the task that governors have, the challenge that governors have, is to allow freedom of speech, to allow freedom of assembly, to allow protests, but to also try to hope that it won't get out of hand, that you won't have violence there. And it's a very difficult balance, I think, to achieve. And it means that I think governors want to, and mayors as well, want to try to keep this under their control, feeling that they are closer to the situation than the president has. And it's also very clear to them, and certainly to me, looking at the president's tweets, is that he's doing this for political reasons, for re-election reasons. He wants to be able to attack the protesters, to be, as he puts it, the law and order president, feeling that this is something that is going to guarantee his re-election. I think there's been blowback to that. Most Americans don't think that he's behaved particularly well in this, but it is an issue. And I think we've actually been fortunate that there's not been more violence in these various protests. Violence on both sides, by the way. You've noticed that there have been some arrests recently of people from the alt-right, the alternative right, who are the ones we see wearing bandoliers and toting guns, who have come to some of these protests, mainly to try to foment violence. And then there's been violence on the side of a few of the protesters as well, certainly looting and burning. Whether these are actual protesters doing it, it's hard to tell, but they may be taking advantage of the protests. We need to be reminded, by the way, going back to this Hitler analogy that I used at the beginning of the talk, that in 1933, I believe it was, the German Bundestag, the parliament building, was burned. And Hitler at the time was the chancellor, and he ordered a lockdown and ordered an attack on communist paramilitary forces, blaming the communists for the arson that created the fire. And that really was the start of the slippery slope towards a full takeover by the Nazis. in Germany. And the argument often has been made, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, that the fire really wasn't set by a communist, who was executed, by the way, for the allegation that he had set the fire. It wasn't really set by a communist, but was set by the Nazis themselves to try to provide a provocation that would enable them to take more power in Germany. I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think the scholars do either. But it's plausible that one side or another will attempt to foment violence so that it can become the savior to protect the country from that violence.
Well, there's some interesting thoughts to leave us with there. Well, thank you, Dr. Beck. We're so glad you were able to join us this week, and we wish that you were here with us at Lakeside, but we look forward to having you on site with us again here, hopefully in the near future. We did have a series more questions, and I'll be putting Dr. Beck's email up online on our website. So if you do have further questions, he said that he would be happy to answer some of those for you, which we appreciate. And thank you to everyone who joined today on Zoom and Facebook and YouTube. We did finally get all of those connected. So we appreciate you spending the time with us today. And please join us again tomorrow. We will be welcoming Marie and John Hildebrandt, who's the president of the Lake Erie the Erie Historical Society, who they'll be talking about the history of tourism in the Lake Erie region. So with that, I thank you all for joining us today. Again, we hope to see you soon, Dr. Beck. And everyone stay cool today. We are sending you our love from Lakeside and hope to be with you all again here soon.
Dakota, let me add a couple of comments. I want to thank you for effectively facilitating all of this, and your intern, Stephanie, as well. I want to thank the audience for what were very, very good and thoughtful questions. And I do want to encourage people not to hesitate if they have further questions, just to send me an email, and I will try to answer those questions as much as I can. I by the way, have never gotten hate mail from the Lakeside group, and I don't expect to get any now, but even if you send me hate mail, I will at least look at it. Whether I respond or not is another question. But thank you very much, and have a good day.
Have a great one. Bye-bye.